Everybody sit back and relax. We're here for a wonderful high noon program. My name is Kevin Koister, the Executive Director of the Western Heritage Center. Thanks to Lauren and Amanda for setting us all up here. Thanks to Community 7, who are our community partner who will film the program for cable access TV. And also we'll have copies of Dr. Lee's program down the road in the future as part of our archives. So I did want to mention a couple programs coming up next month. Third Thursday, we have a wonderful program. I've actually seen this program. He presented in Bozeman, and I asked if he could do it here. And that's Aaron Breen, who's the director of the Crow Tribal Historic Preservation Department. He's doing a program on the war shields that are at the Chicago Field Museum. And the reason that's relevant is the Museum of the Rockies this summer will have an exhibit that shares some of those really incredible family shields that they have. So it's the first time it's left Illinois in over 100 years. So we'll get him here. Hopefully he'll speak about that and then promote the exhibit at the Museum of the Rockies this summer. And that's on May 19th. On Thursday, June 2nd, we have a special program. Lee Silliman, an exhibit curator from Missoula, is coming down to speak on his passion, the art of the bird, flying animals, a historical perspective on avian art. And that's part of, he's the curator who put together the lithograph exhibit downstairs. So he'll be speaking here. We're still looking for him for an evening venue on Thursday, June 2nd also. So some wonderful programs. You can pick the schedule up at the front desk. And our walking tours start in early June this year. And we'll get a schedule out on that pretty soon. So without further ado, I'm going to just make up a bio. I love doing this. Craig Lee was born in a small town. I have no idea. So I'll just go right to, Craig is here. He was here about 6, maybe 8 years ago and did a similar program. So we're really pleased that he could come back. We understand that Dr. Shane Doyle, who presented about Yellowstone National Park, talked about Ice Patch Archaeology. So it's a topic that's in the air. Dr. Lee has directed field projects in Alaska, Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, and published articles in Antiquity, American Antiquity, Arctic, and the Holocene. Dr. Lee received his PhD at the University of Colorado in 2007. He advocates for the emerging field of ice patch archaeology through professional papers and public programs. He is a member of the Glacier National Park Cultural Resources Management Group with the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes and the Blackfeet. He's on the board of directors of the Lamb Spring Archaeological Preserve in Colorado, the board of directors for the Montana Archaeological Society, an instructor at Montana State University, and also director of research and developmental and principal investigator for Metcalf Archaeological Consultants out of Bozeman. Right?
Sure.
Anything else? No, you're doing good. You're happy to be in Billings, aren't you, per day?
Don't tell anybody where I am.
Yeah. Oh, I do. The last sentence says, he does live in Bozeman. Yeah. No, I won't tell him your address, with his wife and daughter. Without further ado, Dr. Craig Lee. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, thank you so much. Let's see here while I put some paperwork out in front of myself so I know where I am. I now have Kevin's notes on me. Excellent. Set those down here. I'm going to set this there. Thank you all so very much for coming out to see a talk, to see me come and talk about Ice Patch Archaeology. It's a subject, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and as a matter of fact, it was, in terms of the mid-latitude or contiguous / conterminous United States, it was actually born in Billings because in 2004, I gave a talk, sort of a what-if talk at the Plains Anthropological Conference, which was held here. And my good friend and colleague, Halcyon LaPointe, who at that point in time was just with the Custer National Forest, but is now with the Custer Gallatin National Forest, came and said, gosh, that is really interesting work. Do you think we should attempt to do something like that here? And I said, I'd absolutely love to. And we put together a little project, and we started in 2005 by immediately not being able to go in the field because there were wildfires going on. And we finally got boots on the ground in 2006, and it's progressed along since then. As Kevin noted, started out doing this work, done work in Alaska, and the thing that really sort of broke the ice, that sounds bad, but the thing that got the real start with this for me was field work in a wonderful place called Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska in 2001. So Montana was hot on the heels of sort of the first of this in the United States, at least. So in terms of what I prepared for you today, with the pandemic and all, I kind of stopped doing sort of broad public overview talks, and I had actually prepared a conference presentation for the national conference, with the first time it's been held since the pandemic, which occurred in Chicago just about a week or two ago, 2 weeks ago. And I thought, you know, it was such a nice kind of overview talk. I thought, boy, I would maybe just sort of share that. And the one thing that would be different from that versus a major overview talk is that I would just ask you to know at this point in time that the field of ice patch archaeology is absolutely a real thing. When I used to give these sort of intro talks, I spent a fair bit of time talking about things like Ötzi the Iceman that was identified in the border of Italy and Austria X number of years ago, and the backstory of how ice patch archaeology developed with some finds in the Yukon Territory. But that kind of stuff is pretty widely available now, and I thought maybe what would be important is to share the kind of content that I can with you just here today, because it's the most current stuff that I've done. So here you go. What you're looking at up on the big screen is an ice patch. This one is, and I'm always a little bit circumscript about where these locations are, but this particular one is in the eastern part of the greater Yellowstone, I'll say, and I think it's a photograph that was taken by my colleague Chris Boyer. We've done a number of different projects with funding from a broad swath of folks, including the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, to not only use computers to model where these locations are, but then to use masterful techniques like remote sensing, which in this case is a camera hung out of the window of Chris's plane. But I think they're really evocative, right? You're looking at kind of the twin things that are reflected in this changing climate. Here you have an ice patch that is melting in the middle of the image, and then you have the valleys infilled with smoke from wildfires. So this is kind of the song of fire and ice. So what is an ice patch? Well, an ice patch is a relatively stable area of permanent snow and ice, and it's much smaller than a glacier. Glaciers undergo a process of plastic deformation due to their own mass and their slope, the slope on which they're sitting, and their depth, relatively speaking, and they basically act as conveyor belts. And so consequently, even though a glacier can sit in a little pocket on a mountainside for many years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, the actual ice that's in it is not necessarily going to be all that old. The residency time for ice in glaciers in our neck of the woods at maximum is about 500 years. That's the length of time it takes for some ice to form at the top of the glacier and for it to flow out of the bottom of the glacier. So they act as conveyor belts, and consequently they don't hold organic materials in them for long periods of time. So I just said this, but unlike a glacier, ice patches exhibit little evidence of internal deformation or movement. What that affords us then, if you recognize ice patches for what they are, and you're looking at things that are not glaciers, you can access things that are normally invisible in these locations. And this does not just occur in the Rocky Mountains. This occurs around the world. We honestly don't know how much of it occurs around the world, because it, as I said, even though the field has been around for almost 20 years, it's still emergent. It's not that there are scads of ice patch archaeological surveys occurring all over the place. But it is growing and expanding. My colleague Will Taylor, who I have co-authored some publications with, has been working in Mongolia, and we actually just last year did a remote sensing survey of locations in Pakistan to look for this type of material. So what the ice patches can contain, because they're static and they don't move, is they can have all of this interesting material in them, some of which is just inorganic, but some of it is organic, and this could be things that are deposited there just as a result of wind-blown sediments, wind-blown grass, leaves, these sorts of things. It can also be materials that are brought to these locations in the guts of animals, basically, and then passed onto the surface of the ice. I hope you can follow along with what I'm saying. This is the past ingesta of an animal's lunch that can show up in these features. But what you can also find are echoes of people's involvement in these locations where they've brought objects of their material culture out while they're engaging with these spaces, not always for hunting, but frequently for hunting. And so what you're looking at here are a couple of examples of these. You're looking at organic artifacts that don't tend to show up in the context of most archaeological sites, because the organic component simply does not preserve. So in the photo on the left, you're looking at a penny, which you should all recognize, but what you're looking at the here next to it is the base of a chipstone projectile point. So it's a broken projectile point. We could find that in a normal archaeological context, but we can't see it in the hafted element. We can't ascertain the type of wood that went into being used for that hafting element. We can't see the care and craftspersonship that was used in the manufacture of that. We can't see the preparation of the sinew lashing. So it greatly expands or enhances our ability to see what, for the bottom line sense, would have comprised the lion's share of the material culture that past peoples were using. We have from ethnographic observation good estimates or measures made that suggest that most cultures, their material culture, if you're talking about hunter-gatherer populations, most of their culture, so I would say 90 to 95% of their culture, is comprised of inorganic materials. And so if most of the archaeological record is comprised of so most of the hunter-gatherer population's materials is comprised of organic materials, so things like the clothing, decorative elements, and so forth. We base most of our understanding of the past on that inorganic component, which only comprises 5 to 10% of their total material culture. So we're already sort of behind the 8 ball to begin with. So the finds that are coming out of ice patches, and one of the things that I'm increasingly trying to impress upon folks is that I think there's, we can't just, at one level, I don't want to be yet another one of these, reduced to one of these sound bites that show up on the news that talk about, the impacts of changing climate. And I think we're almost saturated with it. We've become desensitized to it. And so I think some of my colleagues, particularly at the Institute of Arc and Alpine Research, say, oh, just let this research be a silver lining. But the problem is silver linings don't get funded, and silver linings don't motivate people to get out on the ground and try to engage with something that's changing radically, and that if we don't interact with it, something that we're going to lose the ability to interact with it in sort of future generations. And so what I'm sharing with you in this paper is in the broadest way possible an overview of the nature of ice patch studies that are occurring worldwide at this point in time. And they were born of a meeting that I ran. My colleague E. James Dixon co-ran it with me, but was the primary organizer of something called the Frozen Pasts meeting, The Frozen Past meeting is an international conference or gathering where scientists that are specifically interested, so the choir, so to speak, in this aspect of understanding human history, come together and talk about the challenges that they're facing in the study of changing climate and the emergence of cultural materials. The first meeting had been held in Bern in 2008. You'll see Trondheim in 2010, Whitehorse, Canada, obviously North America, but in 2012, back in Austria in 2016, and then the meeting that I held just last year in September at Chico Hot Springs was the first time that this Frozen Past conference has come to the United States. Wonderfully, the next one is going to be at Quito in Ecuador. Quito is the northern capital of the Incan Empire, so it is a remarkable location to host this meeting. And then, of course, there are climate-related, ice-related studies occurring in South America. So we've got a beautiful program we put together and so forth and so on. And this meeting was supposed to be held, of course, in 2020. A little thing called COVID put the kibosh on that. But even in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds, we were able to pull this off. We had 6 sessions worth of papers, 2 plenary speakers. One of them is a colleague who had been at Salish Kootenai College and is now the THPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Crow Tribe. Aaron Brin talked about actually the shields that will be on display at the Museum of the Rockies, and we're at the Chicago Field Museum. We had a museum exhibition set up in Yellowstone National Park, and then we had 3 field trips as well. A lot of the papers were related to North America. That's been the theme when these meetings have been held. For instance, in Switzerland, there were a lot of papers on sort of the Central European ice patches. When they're held in Norway, there was a good turnout of the Swedes and the Norwegians. So in the United States, it's probably not surprising to see that we had a broad swath of papers represented on topics that are related to Western North America. What you're looking at here in red are locations, and even this little bitty one down here all the way in the Sierra Nevada, the Inyo National Forest, all of these are locations where cultural materials, so materials that are directly related to the heritage of human populations of the Americas, and I'm talking about the indigenous populations, have emerged from melting ice. I think you can maybe see some symmetry in the photos on the right. You're looking at a photo from the Yukon Territory on the top, and then one in the middle is on Jasper National Park. In National Park, I guess it maybe is, but it's certainly provincial as well in Alberta, and then of course down in the lower latitudes in the greater Yellowstone area. And the swath of papers were wide-ranging. One, by probably the founder of the field of this Ice Patch Archaeology in the big picture, the person who knew that things were melting out in the ice patches in the Yukon Territory, but then thought, boy, it could be worth our time, energy, and effort to try to see if these are existing in other locations, moved this research to the Wrangell Mountains and into Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, was E. James Dixon, and he gave a nice talk about sort of broad 20,000-foot view of the context of what we can understand about the nature of these ice patch environments. And one of the things that's a key take-home from this is that unique in the archaeological record to a degree, you almost for certain have a sense of the seasonality in which these features are being used. People are not going to ice patches in the middle of wintertime because there's nothing novel about them, right? There's snow and ice aplenty all over the place. And so if you are able to get into these locations in the summertime, though, all of a sudden you do see there's something novel about them. They provide an upstream source of water, so they truly exist at the headwaters of a lot of very minor streams. They have sort of a micro environment that can be associated with them, where the that past ingesta that I was describing from animals as they're going up to take advantage of these locations, either to cool their feet in the ice. I've seen that sort of plenty of times, but they also take advantage of the well-watered forage right below the ice patches, and the ice patches tend to exist with their backs, so to speak, to the dominant wind direction, so you can kind of get out of the wind if you're up in the high country and you settle in on one of these ice patches. And of course, this kind of thing is not lost on humans. One of the things I thought that was really neat about this last Frozen Pass conference is there was a kind of a neat and very, I think, North American spiritual aspect or spiritual component to it. There were a number of fine papers that were prepared by colleagues who were associated in one way or another with the Central Wyoming College, or CWC. Many of them are underneath the tutelage in some form or another of Todd Gunther. But it was cryospheric inclusive in that there's some talk about glacial extents in the high country of the Wind Rivers. So, for instance, you're looking at major glacier up the Dinwoody here in the image, but there are also these little ice patches that exist in these same environments that don't undergo those same flowing processes, and recognizing that there's sort of a connection between these two types of places was shared. Had some really hard-hitting, rigorous science-type papers in the form of colleagues like Nathan Shellman, who was talking about the application of ground-penetrating radar, which is another form of remote sensing, but it was a way to actually look into the ice and, for instance, have a direct measure of how much ice is left there, which by extension lets us understand something about their potential longevity. So if there's only a half a meter worth of ice left, one good summer could take that out. But if there's 10 meters worth of ice left there, you might say, oh, this thing is showing some resiliency, and maybe there's not as much of a crisis at that particular location. One of the things that became very important to me too in this talk, and one of the things that I think was remembering about the value of giving the broad public talks, is that even though you have chosen to spend part of your Thursday with me, you maybe are not all professional archaeologists as I look around the room, and consequently you sort of represent a swath of the public that's interested but maybe not a content expert on this sort of thing. And I think that there's a value in trying to build broad interest. So I don't know what all of your particular forays or fortes are, what fields you study or what types of work you do, but if you see the potential for synergies with this type of research and things that you have exposure to in your daily life, I think there's a value in that. And my point in bringing that up at this point is that David Christensen's talk, which is highlighted on the lower right, he had not been thinking, he's an ecologist, he's a biologist, so he had been thinking, but he hadn't been thinking about the relationship of animals to these ice patches. Archaeologists, it wasn't lost on us. We knew that hunters were going to these locations and interacting with these animals, but what David hadn't been considering is the potential to sort of track the presence, absence of animals on ice through time using satellite imagery as a way to sort of gauge population density in places, and then to understand something about animal use or animal behavior in these spaces. And he has absolutely gone nuts with this. He's done so much remarkable work, and I think the fact that he's a non-archaeologist who came to this conference and shared a paper and recognized that the archaeology is not just about the archaeology, it's about the big picture of interacting in a broad window. Colleague Kelsey Penniman, was the lead author on a paper that was so evocative of and representational, I guess, of how best practices could come into play in working at these features. Colleague Shane Doyle, who Kevin mentioned at the start of my introduction, has worked with me on the ice patches in the Greater Yellowstone area, as has Lynette St. Clair, Johnny Tim Yellowtail, Other advisors, and like I mentioned, I've done this work in Glacier National Park and in Alaska and the Chugach, and it makes sense. It's a no-brainer to be working with indigenous populations, and it's kind of fun to know that we've been doing this for decades at this point in time, as a result of current directions in the United States to sort of acknowledge a colonial past and to branch out and engage in something that we call DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusivity. The incorporation of tribal perspectives in the conference itself was something that was super important, and I think that gets again towards like Mara Gann's paper, where she was talking about informant-led research to look at sort of sight lines and what's visible from certain sighting stones that are set up that would not normally be the parlance of normal archaeology, where you're simply measuring the weight of the rocks, let's say, that were used for the manufacture of these markers. Instead, this is really talking about how they're functioning and still actively functioning in these landscapes. Other types of archaeology that's coming out of the ice patches, we discussed in detail. In the lower right-hand corner, you can sort of see the archaeology of the objects themselves. Scientific techniques, the ability to make inquiries of objects of material culture, particularly the organic types of objects, have greatly increased in the last number of years. It's now absolutely commonplace to be able to take micro samples of material and obtain very specific, very firm genetic identifications on what types of materials were being used. And this is not just for things like the antler or the bone, but even the sinew themselves, the sinew itself. Archaeometric studies talking about the relatedness of the ochre sources that are showing up on artifacts that are being identified in ice patches through time. This is it's a whole burgeoning field, and I think again it's a special field because it can take advantage of the organic components that are present in the ice patch record. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a really neat artifact. This is something that was identified at one of the ice patches here in the eastern portion of the Greater Yellowstone, and it's basketry. From an ethnographic standpoint, basketry, when it was being made in large quantities, was generally under the purview of women, craftspeople. So they were the master artisans of this material culture, and the presence of this artifact in the high alpine is another one of the things that we've used to make the argument that broad swath of the population that was up here is not just a broad swath of the representative population of mountain and mountain adjacent folks included not just hunting parties of men, which show up with the hunting tools, but also with women. And so we're plowing forward on that. It's been a very long process, but we're making headway. So one of the things I think that was kind of a take-home from my talk, the talk that I gave at the SAA meeting, is that I think there's actually probably more value in most of us that are working in climate-impacted archaeological settings in talking to the public about it, as opposed to going to session after session where we're going into echo chambers and just talking amongst ourselves about how this stuff is all significant. And so I feel like, in part, when Kevin reminded me that I'd said I would come over and give a talk, I actually sort of was chomping at the bit, because I thought this is important, and I want to be able to get this in front of you as my audience for the day. But also, I think it's important to make sure that amongst other scientists that we are working in an allied way, and that we're trying to see where there's complementary research directions that are occurring. And I thought I'd include one sort of test case or case scenario here. And this is with regard to bighorn sheep, right? Bighorn sheep are popular not just with archaeologists, but they're popular with hunters. They're popular with folks that like to go to the alpine and see them as an active part of animal community. They have spiritual significance to broad swaths of populations. The Shoshone-Bannock in particular are very intimately interested in the bighorn sheep population, and it so happens that bighorn sheep have been emerging from ice patches, and in many instances the bighorn sheep that are emerging are definitely related to cultural activity. As my colleague Shane Doyle likes to say, they are representative of a ceremonial landscape, because what we see predominantly at ice patches are the crania of the bighorn sheep. So we see the horn cores there on that skull in the lower left-hand picture, and you don't find much in the way of the postcranial elements. And we think what's happening is that bighorn sheep are being hunted in these locations, and that the postcranial elements are carried off of the ice, processed, eaten, used, and then the natural taphonomic process of decay takes away that postcranial remains. But we're seeing that the crania themselves are taken back to the ice patches and placed on the ice patches. This is not unlike what we see with the Shoshone sheep trapping, also in the greater Yellowstone area, but particularly on the eastern side of things. But one of the things that's kind of neat about that is, well, with the Shoshone sheep trapping, is we have a record of it, let's say, that goes back maybe 500 years. But with these bighorn sheep skulls that are coming out of the ice patches, we see that we now have a record of this interaction of human populations with bighorn sheep going back more than 6,000 years. This is pretty impressive and should not be lost on you. Bouncing back over to this slide, though, one of the things that we determined we could do is not only get really accurate radiocarbonages based on tiny little fragments of bone from these bighorn sheep, but we could also interface with modern-day geneticists, so folks like Elizabeth Flesch, Dr. Robert Garrett, but we could also access out of these little pieces of material the genetic signature of these now long dead bison, or long dead sheep from 6,000 years ago. Dr. Beth Shapiro runs the paleogenomics lab at the University of California. I think she's at Santa Barbara. If you'd like me to say something wrong, Santa Cruz. And at any rate, what she and Dr. Elizabeth Flesch and Jennifer Thompson were able to do was compare the genomes of the ancient bighorn sheep that had melted out of the archaeological ice patch sites with the modern bighorn sheep to try to identify what imparts resiliency to some bighorn sheep populations relative to others. And by that, what I mean is that there's a lot of zoonotic disease, particularly pneumonias that have come into wild bighorn sheep population as a result of their interaction with domestic sheep population, and it's wiped out the wild bighorn sheep population in certain areas. By being able to see what, and this is still ongoing work, it's not been published yet, but by being able to identify, and we've been successful at this, by being able to identify what imparts certain resiliencies, let's say to populations outside of Cody, Wyoming, where there's been a lot of grazing, we're hoping to be able to sort of hone in on those genetic characteristics and see if we could make sure that those are highlighted in the sheep populations that get transplanted to other locations like the Tendoy Mountains here in Montana, which regularly fail with the sheep reintroduction efforts. Okay, so how do we engage the public? There's a number of different ways to do this, and Kevin and colleagues at the Western Heritage Center, this video is streaming online. It's had 10,000 views. It was masterfully made by Montana PBS with masterful support, financial support from the National Forest System in particular. I think you can't get a better video describing ice patch archaeology in 9 minutes. So if you just Google Ice Patch Archaeology Vimeo, it'll come right up. So I would invite you all to watch this. It's got a really high production value in it. We've also worked to create a traveling museum exhibit, and importantly, I hope this is not lost on you, when we first made this exhibit, which has actually been shown here, I think, for about 1 week. It was a very transitory appearance here. It's been on steady display since March of 2018, but it opened on the Wind River Reservation, and it was through Lynette St. Clair that got it down there. And we went to 3 different communities. We went to Ethitie, we went to Riverton, and we went to Lander with it. And again, the importance in that is that this is material that is related to the modern living descendant communities, and we felt like it was important in this sort of very public display type scenario to make sure that the information was being shared locally first. And so that's part of our ethos, and so that's what we've done. It's currently on display actually at my old stomping grounds at the University of Colorado. There's 2 requests for it now. One is for it to go to Nevada, and another one is for it to come back to Montana. I'm trying to work on the logistics for that in my copious spare time, but it's had many, many visitors in these different locations, and hopefully you can get to see it when it comes to a community near you. Anytime an opportunity comes up that helps us get this in front of folks, we've taken advantage of it. The state of Montana used the topic of Ice Patch Archaeology for their Archaeology Month poster back in 2010, and jokingly here, but Wyoming was a little bit late to the party on this, but they used it in 2018, and they did have a really high production value poster. They took images that we'd collected as in the course of our research, and then they make about 5,000 of these posters, and they send them all around the country. You might recognize the font for Frozen in Time. I had not realized this, but apparently Disney makes, for some uses, makes that font open access. So that's from the movie Frozen from Disney, and they said, "Yeah, this is a good use. Go ahead, use it." And so with no other qualms, we did. We've also made some nice websites. Currently, all of the websites are down because we ran out of money to host them. There is some money that comes to this research from different sources, but it's not like a huge amount. And as per usual in archaeology, we're trying to make omelets without eggs. But what you're looking at here is a still from an animation, a computer-based animation that you could watch on a website. I'm hoping in the next year or 2 I'll be able to get it reborn. But again, this is something that has an interactive aspect that I think students can engage with. It's been a theme throughout my talk. I've mentioned my desire to make sure that this material is being treated in an appropriate way and is interacting and benefiting with the communities whose ancestors made this material. And I think that it's kind of like, having done this for a couple of decades now, it no longer seems surprising to me at all that working with and talking with native populations about what's going on with the nature of this archaeology, it's sort of a no-brainer. One of the things, though, that's sad that's happening is, it's another example where the characterization of, let's say, wilderness as a land untrammeled by man, as it's described in the Wilderness Act, is a mischaracterization, and it's disingenuous to the indigenous populations that have called this area home, in their words, since time immemorial. But from an archaeological sense, from the instant the ice melted off, you have Clovis projectile points, which were associated with mammoth hunters at Gardner, Montana. So coming right up the valley bottoms, no doubt, when mammoths were still present there, so right to the footstep of Yellowstone National Park. As the ice is melting out of these ice patch features and this organic content is being released, the once halted processes of decay start up again. The organic material can decay quite quickly. The sinew lashing comes off very quickly. The fletching comes off very quickly. Any paints or pigments that have been applied come off, and very quickly you're reduced to just the inorganic components like the projectile points that we can find in other contexts. And I liken this to sort of a sanitization of the archaeological record. So if we sit back and allow this to happen, it's one more obvious marker that I think tribal populations can point to and say, no, tribal folks have been in these locations for a very long time, and if the ice is allowed to melt out without us interfacing with it, we are allowing basically a loss to occur, not just for our own generation, not just for past generations, but future generations. So, I can see I've got a typo here. That's Carol Murray, not Carol Murphy, but at least Murphy is spelled correctly. So songs, origin stories, sacred teepees, plants, birds, and animals in our bundles all come from the Rocky Mountains. This is Carol's word talking about the relationship between the Blackfeet and the mountains. And my colleague, I think the one that gives me the most sense of where tribal folks find significance in this research comes from my colleague Francis Auld, and he mentioned in one of our other videos, he just simply said, protection of these resources is essential for sustaining the living cultures. And to paraphrase Francis, he's far more eloquent than I, but what he was saying is he's not interested in seeing these collections or cultural materials be collected from ice patches to go be squirreled away in museums or repositories. Where he sees value in these are where does it instill a curiosity, a wonder, a knowledge for indigenous populations, and in particular for indigenous youth who face a lot of pressures from a lot of different directions. And I think there's a possibility that the ice patch cultural material can kind of act as a lodestone that draws in tribal youths from many different groups as sort of a nucleating site for promoting understanding not just of the past but of today, and how do you exercise rights and directions for wanting to make sure that human beings, that aging tribal populations can still get access to these locations when they have been somewhat artificially cut off from access as they are now. There's a dedicated journal for this. It's the Journal of Glacial Archaeology. Jokingly, we call it JOGA, but the JOGA Journal has been in existence now for a number of years. We've pretty much had about one issue per year that comes out. But if you do find this work of interest, and if you have the opportunity, I would say either you could take the journal yourself, or you could push your local library to try to take it. These things live and breathe based on subscribership. They don't happen otherwise, and I can tell you as one of the editors of the journal, it's an entirely unfunded position. It's just yet another labor of love to be working on these. So I think it's cool if you can see a way clear towards sort of promoting that. And I have no idea if you found that talk to be of interest or not. I didn't see anybody fall asleep. It's kind of fun to get back up and talk to a broad audience. I do generally fairly well with questions, so if you want to hit me with something, please do. Please.
Do ice patches form the same way as glaciers?
Yes and no. I guess probably largely more towards no. So ice patches form by having an upwind area, I think I'll go back one more. So that big ice patch that you're looking at in this particular picture, you have upwind from it, or a place where snow can collect and then be blown off of and then redeposited. So the ice patch is basically living on the backside, sort of tucked in on this hill. Its existence is largely due to wind-blown snow. There is some seasonal snow that falls on it directly, but the massive volume that's present there is really coming as a result of snow being blown over the crest of the hill and then being dropped out of the wind column and sort of building up and depositing on this like a massive drift, like a cornice that you see on a mountain. The thing that stops them from becoming glaciers is that there's not a huge head wall right above it. So there's not a jagged line of peaks right there so high that the sun doesn't hit it. So basically what happens is its growth is kept in check because it's seasonally decapitated by a little bit of sun that hits it. So the sun that hits it is able to stop it from building up so much mass that it would start to flow. It's a good question. You have a follow-up, maybe, and then I'll go to you, but what's your follow-up?
So these human beings that left these things there, are they on the ice patch or are they under the ice patch?
So the artifacts that we identify tend to be, the only reason they could have been preserved the way they were is because they were actually in the ice itself. There are a number of different studies that have tried to identify the temperature profile of ice patches. Are they warmer underneath? Do they have some down melting? Or are they truly stable and, let's say, underlain by permafrost? Different ice patches work in different ways, and the ones that are underlain by permafrost are going to contain older material, whereas the ones that aren't underlain by permafrost are going to contain younger material. When they were being accessed by human beings, it's most likely that they were hunting from next to the ice, animals that were on the ice, and then you lose the material in the snow on the ice. It's like kind of like dropping your keys. You're not going to find it until it melts out. Sorry, Kevin, but you were out in front.
Actually, you kind of answered it. I was kind of wondering if when you scan it, can you see these artifacts in the ice onto your projection screen?
No. The resolution of something like ground penetrating radar is good for looking at like basal profile. So what's the pocket like that the ice patch is sitting in, but it does not pick up specific items. You can't say, oh, there's a dart shaft there, or there's a sheep skull there. It's not that level of resolution. But one of the things that we can see with it is the presence of layers in the ice. So there have been periods of melting that have occurred in the past, and this is something that is important to note. I think anecdotally, it's not very often that we find, let's say, aero technology at this latitude. We find more dart technology, untitled dart technology, throwing board technology predates the aero technology. I think that a lot of the aero technology melted out conceivably in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl era, when I know these features were radically melted, and I know they were radically melted because I've done the review of newspapers in Wyoming that talk about the crazy melting that was going on at the glaciers in the 1930s. One of the phrasings that comes to mind is the stinking imbricated masses of grasshoppers that had been disgorged from below the Dinwiddie Glacier. Kevin?
As a former archaeologist, of course, we always gridded things out, and there's a lot of the process for finding and identifying layers. This seems quite different. What is the process as an archaeologist with an ice patch?
Well, one of the things that I can say is, with the exception of coring, I've cored ice. So I've taken from the National Science Foundation on a couple different occasions a coring device that's used in Greenland normally, but I brought it to our ice patches at enormous cost and used it to core down into the ice and to remove something, about the size of that. That's the only excavation I've ever done in a mid-latitude ice patch. It's the idea of trying to go prospecting in an ice patch, A, sounds horribly colonial when I just phrased it like that, but B, would just be a fool's errand. The density of material is not super high. You can find sometimes one artifact, sometimes two artifacts, sometimes more, sometimes, and actually far more commonly, none, at a particular ice patch. So basically we wait for the ice to melt, and then we try to engage with it when we sort of have an optimal timing. And this is my opinion on this, but in my sense of it, in the ice patches that we have identified that contain the most precious cultural materials, I think that it's incumbent on us to try to figure out a way to bolster snow catchment on those locations. So set up, let's say, snow fences to artificially bolster the amount of snow that's accreting there, and to do it at the right time of year, so we allow the penetration of the winter cold waves so that ice can get nice and good and cold, and then put that insulating snow. on top of it. I think that the cultural material will be far safer for future generations if it can continue to live in the ice patches as opposed to be put into museum spaces or government repositories that can be subject to the whims of voters and administrivia when they decide they're not going to fund something anymore. In instances, that particular ice patch right there contained an artifact that was over 10,000 years old, just to give you a sense of it. So ice that was at that location existed for 10,000 plus years, and the ice that contained the artifact at that location for 10,000 plus years has melted. I do have a dog in the fight as to whether it's anthropogenic warming or not, but whatever my particular opinions are on it, you can liken this scenario to a library being on fire. If you come across a library on fire, do you stand around pointing fingers and casting blame about who lit the fire, or do you try to get the books out of the library? Get the books out of the library, and then you can sit around and point fingers at what's causing it. And so that's where, when I give these talks giving these talks to oil and gas conferences, and I say I'm not, I make a lot of money with oil and gas in my cultural, the fields of cultural resource management, because it's a necessary part of our combustion engines and everything else. But I say, you don't try to look away and say, oh, I'm not going to engage with this research because it's mentioning climate. It's a real thing. Kevin?
If by chance you were hiking in the mountains and you saw, the basket seems extraordinarily rare.
Yeah.
If you saw something sticking out of the ice, what would you do as a citizen?
The thing to do is to contact the land managing agency's archaeologist. And so if you're on the Shoshone National Forest, that would be colleague Kyle Wright. If you're on what was just the Koister National Forest, that would be Halsa and LaPointe, or maybe more importantly, Mike Bergstrom. If you're on the Gallatin, it would be Connie Constant. If you're down in Yellowstone, it's Beth Horton. It's contact an agency person, take a picture with your phone, do the best that you can to get a GPS point on it. Don't try to engage with it. The basket, the recovery of the basket, was we had 6 archaeologists present. We had stabilization supplies. We were able to get it in a very thoughtful manner. It's entirely possible that there are non-cultural materials that you might observe at an ice patch. I think that those environments are sort of beautiful in a way because they are living and breathing and sort of going about their own lives. And if you pick up, let's say, a non-cultural stick and take it out of that location and bring it into a repository or bring it into an archaeologist and say, what do you think of this? You may well have collected a several 100-year-old or several 1,000-year-old piece of wood that is part of enriching that biota as it decays up there. You've hauled it down. There's no mandate or place that it can be stored, so it goes on your mantle for a while until your grandkids forget about it and then gets chopped or broken or something. So I generally say, if at all possible, just leave it there. But if it's something that has a possibility to engage a broad swath of the public and be of educational value for descendant communities as well as other interested parties, if you tell the agency folks that they have the resources at their disposal to go and engage with something like that. It's a good question, Kevin. Thank you. Sir?
You said 10,000 years. What's the oldest?
That is the oldest from anywhere in the world. So not just here in North America. Those superlatives do tend to gather attention, but I think that the broad swath obviously is much younger in age, and that's where we can sort of do comparisons of change through time and look at different uses of materials and try to use, let's say, the numbers of well-dated artifacts as a proxy for populations going into the alpine. Then we think about it in terms of a climate scenario. We think, well, are people going to the alpine more frequently when it's really hot and dry down in the Yellowstone River Valley? Those kind of things are cool. So all of the artifacts matter. It's not just that there's one old one, or it's not just that there's some really young ones. I've got several that are just several hundred years old. pictures, but I think they're all wonderful. Okay.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
glad to stay afterwards. Thank you all.